I was not unique in taking on a CEO role in an organisation facing a particularly challenging business environment. In fact, most CEOs embark on their role in similar circumstances. The specific challenges that I faced at Wesley Mission related to my taking on the role of CEO and superintendent, a dual role, that is of a business leader and church leader.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Can I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land in which we meet, the Gadigal people of Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I'm Mark Scott, a long-time friend of Wesley Mission and of Keith and Carol, and I'm delighted to be emceeing today. I'm also your social distancing marshal. Now, I see appropriate social distancing take place. I have the phone number of the police commissioner and the chief health officer in my pocket. I don't want to have to use it. Now, I can see we've got separation appropriate in the auditorium now, but the real test will come when Keith's new book is available afterwards. That's when the scramble and the unseemly rushing will take place as everyone tries to procure a signed first edition of this great new book. But I encourage you to follow the rules and follow the guidelines. It's wonderful to be here and to hear Keith reflect on his 15 years of leadership here at Wesley Mission and the lessons he's learned that can be applied for many of us in a workplace, in a leadership environment. I was reflecting that 15 years ago, when Keith started here, none of us had heard of an iPhone or an iPad. Streaming was things that Rivers did, or perhaps your nose during hay fever season. Your face was in a book. We didn't know about Facebook. The world has dramatically changed. John Howard was Prime Minister of Australia. That was dozens of Prime Ministers ago compared to what we've experienced now. Donald Trump was an American reality television buffoon. So it's good to know that some things haven't changed, but fundamentally the world is very, very different now to the way it was back then. And as Keith alluded to, I think, in this video, and one of the things that I always felt strongly in my conversations in dealing with him was the complex duality of the role of leadership here at Wesley Mission, which I argued for a long time, I think, is unique in an Australian context and possibly unique in a global context, because there you have the minister, the pastor, the person with oversight of numerous complex and diverse congregations diverse in terms of the community that they bring together, diverse in terms of the geography in which they occupy, and as we know, very long-standing in its historic tradition, going all the way back to the early days of the colony here in Sydney. And then on the other hand, you have this extraordinary for-purpose organisation delivering services in the very, very heart of our community, particularly supporting those in greatest need, in aged care and hospitals, supporting our children whose lives have been under pressure and in great distress, and increasingly, and evident over the time of Keith's work here, taking on roles and responsibilities that traditionally have been held in the hands of government. So notwithstanding the role as a pastor and a spiritual leader, a business leader, a CEO of an organisation employing thousands with revenues of hundreds of millions of dollars, a great scale, a great complexity. And what Keith's done is his new book has drawn on insights and experiences across the duality, how they inform each other and how that experience can help us in our leadership roles and can help us in our responsibilities in our modern society. So I'm really glad he's written the book, and I'm really glad that you're all here to hear from Keith this morning. Given the circumstances, given the time, there are a few guests who would normally have been here but have not been able to join us, and we're going to hear from some of them through the morning as well. And first of all, a long-time friend of Wesley Mission, local MP, a minister and a shadow minister during Keith's time here. We're going to hear now from the Honourable Tanya Plibersek.
Keith Garner probably doesn't remember the first time we met, but I certainly do. We were at a Pancake Day breakfast, and this new leader of Wesley was sitting next to me, talking to me about his journey, what brought him to leading Wesley Mission. And I knew from that moment that I'd met a kindred spirit. Keith has the most enormous heart. He's got so much compassion, so much love for people, particularly the most disadvantaged, homeless Australians, people who are struggling. I saw that every day that I worked with him. But Keith's got something else as well. He's got a really sharp mind, a real ability to grow an organisation, to grow its mission and grow its success. And so it's such a pleasure to be able to say congratulations, Keith, on the launch of this marvellous book, which I'm sure will make such a difference to so many leaders who are struggling to combine their ethics, their values, with their desire to achieve greater things with the organisation that they lead. Of course, this comes after 15 years of leading a terrifically successful organisation, 15 years that have seen a lot of hard work and a lot of achievement from Keith. And I know that he's looking forward to slowing down a little bit after these extraordinary 15 years at the helm of Wesley. So Keith, congratulations on the book, and congratulations too on the marvellous contribution you've made to the lives of some of Australia's most disadvantaged people, to the leadership you've shown and the integrity you've shown, and well done on a well-deserved, I'm sure it's not going to be a complete break, but maybe stepping back the pace a little bit. I'm sure your family will be delighted to have a bit more of you at home.
These chairs are here this morning, and over the last 15 years, Keith has sat down in an armchair and interviewed very many people here at Wesley Mission and on his television program and in other places. I think of Easter breakfasts and the like, great events and rituals in the history of Wesley Mission. So it's great to see the armchairs out again, and it's great to see the tables reversed. And rather than asking the questions, Keith will be answering the questions. And I'm delighted that asking the questions this morning we have Dr. Meredith Lake. Many of you will know Meredith. She currently hosts Soul Search on ABC Radio National. She's been a guest presenter on Compass. She's an honorary associate of the Department of History at Sydney University. She's an award-winning writer, including her cultural history of the Bible in Australia, which won the Australian History Prize at both the Prime Minister's Literary Awards and the New South Wales Premier's History Awards. So we're delighted to welcome Meredith to pose the questions. and she'll be questioning a man who needs no introduction.
Well, good morning. What a special morning this is. And I know that the Reverend Keith Garner is known and loved by everybody in this room, but it is worth thinking about, just as a way of introduction, what the last 15 years has meant. Your life and work has been marked by a commitment to the wider community, as Tanya just said. Not just here at Wesley Mission, but for decades, expressing deep compassion in action for people on the margins of our community. Here, in practical terms, you lead 2,500 staff, over 5,000 volunteers, and congregations of more than 1,500 people. The last 15 years haven't been ordinary. You've led this organisation through government changes in terms of outsourcing and policy, the global financial crisis, soaring numbers of vulnerable Australians, royal commissions, now a pandemic, and through all that, building a resilient organisation financially and culturally, serving more and more Australians in need. You've had a particular focus on tackling youth suicide, especially in Indigenous communities, expanding a suicide prevention program to more than 100 locations across Australia. Homelessness has been another huge challenge. You're a founding director of the End Street Sleeping Collaboration, which works internationally. In 2015, this was recognised, all this work, when you were made a member of the Order of Australia, quote, for significant service to the community as an advocate for people who are homeless and socially disadvantaged, and to pastoral care. And that combination, as Mark just said, being one of the distinctive blessings of your work. After all of that, I don't know how you found time to write a book, but on the eve of your retirement at the end of this year, you have penned a book. And I guess to begin with, what prompted you to carve out the space to pen some of your insights and put them to paper? What was your hope with that process?
Well, chiefly because I don't think I've met anybody trying to do what I'm trying to do. And so I thought I'd try and share what that means and looks like. And also I think there's a lot of questions people have in their minds of how you can possibly be doing this and this at one and the same time. So because of that, I wanted to talk about that. I still have an English accent, but I'm now an Aussie. In every sense except cricket. And in every way, I feel part and parcel of this country. But if you'd said to me 20 years ago, you'd be living in Australia doing the job, I wouldn't have believed it. In fact, when I went back from the UK, I said to people, they asked me, what's it like in Australia? This is when I came out to visit family. I said, it's a nice place. I couldn't live there, you know. And now I'm a citizen, so I'm part and parcel of the Australian. I think a lot of people have said that kind of thing. So it's really because I wanted to try and share that experience. It hasn't all been easy. And I'm hoping that I reflect that in the book. It hasn't been easy. There have been times of challenge. There's been times when thinking through how Christian faith can possibly live alongside tough business decisions.
You've had roles that have made explicit something that perhaps a lot of Christian leaders have to grapple with, and that is the combination of being a person of faith and having a role in which that needs to be expressed, but in which you're not entirely captain of the situation, where you've had to compromise, find ways of joining up the dots between faith and the demands being made of you. What do you think makes Christian leadership distinctive? Because it's about more than having a certain role, isn't it?
It is. I think it's about discernment to some extent, discerning how we live out our lives. I have to say, I have never felt it necessary to hide my faith. In all the years, whether it's sitting with the Prime Minister, whether it's talking to union leaders, people left and right, and people outside the church, and I've never felt I've had to hide it away, but I have had to think through, what is the way now in which I can articulate this faith? Naming the name is important, but it's not just about naming the name, it's about speaking what that name means in the specific circumstances of people's hurt and pain and loss. So trying to do that has been a big challenge, but I think it's what any Christian leader has to do if they're serious.
You've worked with a lot of people over your many years in ministry. Who are some of those who've modelled that to you? Are there Christian leaders that have had a particular impact in your own life and in the way you navigate this particular challenge?
It's not always known. I don't come from a Christian background at all. I was a teenager when I found faith. And I really was helped most of all by a miner.
A miner?
A miner who was not greatly articulate, and yet he gave time to me. I learnt an enormous amount from this man, seeing a person who somehow embraced what Christ meant and lived a life in a tough context. And I felt whatever the future would hold for me, I wanted to exemplify something of that in my own life. People have demonstrated. I can think of a man who was a professional cricketer, who I admired enormously. I watched him and I saw him, and I saw somebody who held to values in a context where values were not easy. And when I started talking about values and how you live alongside them in a way you hold on to them, even when they're not easily acceptable to people, and I think many people in business have to do that every day. They have decisions to make, they have to face things. And I thought, if I do anything, it's learning from these people who in my own life have marked out something, and many people in Sydney here. The one thing I'd say about Aussies is that they are open to receive newness. And I thought that was good, really, because it meant when I was coming into the place, I didn't have to argue why I wanted to talk to people. People were willing to talk, were open, and I think it helped enormously.
I was struck reading your book that it wasn't just the people in your own experience that have walked alongside you through all this, but there's a deep consciousness too of history, of being part of something that goes back centuries, back to the 18th century, to Wesley himself. Mm-hmm. I wonder what lessons about Christian leadership you've drawn from your reflections on that history and also the history of this organisation. Maybe things you've sought to emulate, but also perhaps warnings?
Far be it from me to teach somebody as a historian about history. I remember talking to a friend of mine who is a Vice-Chancellor at Oxford, and he said that John Wesley was possibly one of the greatest Oxford men when he looked back on the history of Oxford, for some of the same reasons that you've talked about with me, really. He was an academic, he was an evangelist, he was a preacher, yet he was also beginning schools, he was working alongside people that were poor, he believed the gospel had to be translated. So history for me has its roots in Wesley, not because of him as a person, but because of what he represented. And down the years, I've been attracted to people who've had that ability to hold those things together. The history of Wesley Mission is unique. I think when history is written, what this place represents in history is enormous. It has its undoubted Methodist history, but it has an enormous history being willing to stand up when Vietnam was at its height and saying, we just don't believe that that's right. And, you know, nobody would argue about that now. They might have said about Alan when he was getting people on the streets and joining the many other voices in Sydney, oh, this is all extreme. I think most people would say it was a ridiculous war and a waste of life and many things that have followed from that. The history of being willing to speak up has been something that's very much in the bloodstream here.
I wanted to ask you about advocacy, really, and especially advocacy that might not be widely taken up in a community at a particular moment in its history, because that has been one of the challenges for faith-based, for-purpose organisations over the last several decades, especially as kind of the relationship between government and charity has fluctuated with what scholars call that kind of moving frontier between government and non-government organisations. Why do you think advocacy, as well as as well as kind of relief, actually addressing need, is so important for a Christian organisation?
I think it's relevant. The gag clause, for example,
yes.
Looking back at times when in the Howard government and at the time there were people saying we should put these chains around. I've talked to John Howard about it, really. I think, in fact, we have to be prepared to find the language, the place and the moment to speak the thing. There are some people who stand on a rock and shout, No, I'm not convinced that's the right way. I think we have to find the right place, the right moment, and not be afraid to move into that place where you might be challenging what's going on. And I've got to say that when you do it in the right way, I found left and right are prepared to listen to that. And I don't think it's something that we might do. I think we should do it. We have to do it. Because if we don't do it, who is going to do it?
Well, why? Can you explain that a little bit more? Because in a way it's instinctive. I think you're right for many Christians. But I think it's quite hard for a wider community to understand. Like, why are those Christians going on about this? Like, what for you motivates that?
I think you have to make sure that you don't get put into a block or a box. For example, Methodists were known by some people in their minds for what they were against rather than what they were for.
Sure.
And they would spend their time banging the drum about alcohol, about this or that and the other. And all those things have been vitally important. I mean, alcohol's a major issue in our community. But you have to work out what is the right thing to talk about. And I think for Christians, that's when you'll be heard. Many outside the church, if you're just going to be banging a drum, are just going to see it as just that. But if you're prepared to say that if you take us seriously, we can make a difference to the society in which we live. And that's what I think we're really about. We're not about just holding a banner up and speaking for our crowd, whoever our crowd is, but actually saying we want to contribute something to this society that will make a difference when we've gone.
As part of your leadership, you've also had to deal with the challenge of the bottom line, turning a not-for-profit organisation that wasn't making a profit into a for-purpose organisation that stewarded its resources in a way that enabled it to pursue that vision that you've outlined. How have you dealt with that particular challenge? I mean, is it hard to be, I guess, a conviction leader in that kind of hard-nosed space? What has been the pointy end of that for you?
I mean, the thing for me is that you've got no option. If you're really going to be heard and you're really going to make a difference, then you have to be able to manage the bottom line. You have to do that because you're never going to be able to actually make a difference to society and community if you don't do that. That's the first reality. I think you have to make choices sometimes. I remember a long time ago somebody telling me that the biggest differences are not between good and bad, but between good and the best. So you have to, as you're working, think through what is the thing here that is really fundamentally going to change things. And sometimes that means really engaging in the economic realities of where we are. Because during this 15 years, so much has changed economically in the world and in Australia. And I've watched it happening all around me. And I think you have to be prepared to change. You have to be prepared to move. You have to be prepared to be flexible, ready to respond to the challenges of the day, whatever those challenges are. And for me, money doesn't matter because, in fact, if you don't... I've never really liked, as you know in the book, I don't like the term not-for-profit.
No.
It's not a term that I like. For purpose speaks much more meaningfully to me. And we are an organisation that is for purpose, wanting to make a real difference to the community.
Thinking about that, I was struck by something your predecessor, who you've mentioned, Sir Alan Walker, said. Founding Lifeline, he believed that much of the urban despair that he was hoping to alleviate reflected actually unmet spiritual need in a modern society. I wonder what your reflections are on that diagnosis and whether there's something about being a Christian for-purpose leader that might lead you to call the moment we're in and diagnose it perhaps differently to the way a more secular welfare provider might.
Yeah, I do believe that we're living in a very significant moment in the story of the world. It raises all kinds of spiritual challenges for us.
Such as?
Well, it raises the question about what is life for? Is materialism going to be the end goal of the world in which we're in? How do we find ways in which we can build a community that embraces all, that includes all and counts people in? All those kind of questions are there. But it seems to me that we have to find ways in expressing the Christian faith in a way that isn't a kind of churchy, locked-in way, you know. I think, and I have to say many church people are locked into this as much as anybody. We have to find ways in which we can talk about Jesus Christ, that we can talk about what faith means in a language that's there. If in fact Alan was right, and I think he was, that the greatest challenge in a city is loneliness and isolation, if that's true, then I found that isolation as much in boardrooms as it is on the street corner. I found it in family life as much as I have in individuals. Loneliness and isolation is one of the marks of our society. And maybe this spiritual reality of where we are now might raise people to ask questions about that. And certainly the materialism is really a big issue.
You've got a clear, it's so obvious, isn't it, that you're a pastor with that pastoral heart for our community. But almost looking the other direction to the business world.
Yes.
What do you think this kind of Christian approach might have to contribute to that segment of our society?
I have to say I've met many, many fine Christians in business. Many, many. I mean, it's ridiculous to say that they're not there. But it is difficult for them sometimes to say, how does this work when I've got to make 150 people redundant next Monday? How does this work when I've got to communicate on the floor that there's a change of philosophy going to drive the management of the company now at this point in time? And I think we have to find ways in which we can not be in any way ashamed of this faith that guides us, but actually conscious of the challenges that people have to make every day. And I've never found that you have to dump the compassionate heart to actually do business. And that really is important, to be able to keep holding that sense that people matter. Now, I have to say to you, that doesn't mean it's any easier when you've got somebody in a room and you've got to tell them, I'm sorry, this role that you've done is no longer going to be. It's very, very hard. But I do believe it's possible somehow to find the words, the way, the methods, the meaning, to be able to express what compassion is to people in times of struggle.
Is there a structural element to that as well? How do you scale this so that it's not just about the interpersonal, but something that a whole organisation can live and breathe, that becomes embedded, if you like, in the organisation itself? What's the insight you've learned on that question?
Well, something we've done over the last 2 years, really, 3 years, is we've started talking about most in need. And trying to understand what does most in need mean. And we found when we talked about most in need, nearly everybody was working with the most in need. So we had to say, what does most in need mean when you spell it out in the specific circumstances of business? And I think that one of the ways in which we can be a meaningful organisation in this space is actually to address that question. What does most in need? It means maybe those people that wouldn't get helped if you weren't there. You know, and that really is. And actually be prepared to, and for me in homelessness, this is a really big challenge, being prepared to try to help people to understand homelessness is not the caricatures. It's much more profound. And that you have to not only address the person who is on the street with the bottle, but you have to address the question of the fact that we have the wrong economics that sometimes make it difficult, that we have in Sydney hundreds of properties that are empty. In this city. And unless we're prepared to address that and say homelessness means not only the issue of the individual, but how do we change the politics and the way that will enable people to make a difference in those areas?
Reading your book, Keith, I was really struck by a recurring phrase you used, reflective practice.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate a little bit more on what you mean by that and why it's so important for the kind of Christian leadership that you've pursued?
Well, you'll know that I refer to Sean's book, really, about reflective practitioner, because I think there's all the difference in the world between having a vision and a hope, and being prepared to look back on circumstances, incidents, and things that happen, and say, how did that happen? What happened? How could I make a difference? And reflective practitioner, I think anybody who's a professional should be doing that all the time, thinking through very carefully. People use the word reflective, actually, but they just mean thinking. And I don't think it just means thinking. I think it means thinking in a specific way that would help us to really address the things that we do and say and are. So when you become a reflective practitioner, it becomes a natural part of your life. You're asking it all the time. How has this happened? Why has this happened? What can I do? How can I make a difference? So I think I keep repeating it. I didn't realize I said it that often, but I think I did. I think you're absolutely right. I do, because it's so much a part of what I think is important.
And yet I thought there was more there than a kind of self-awareness, even a deep self-awareness. I wondered how it connects with your own devotional life. It seemed to me that there was something there that perhaps isn't often discussed, but that for a Christian leader might be important, even decisive.
I mean, you've seen that I hint at it in the book, but in reality, those who really know me know I can be quite a lonely person and an isolated person myself, that I have struggled sometimes with the challenge of being in the public space. I can sometimes find, for example, I come out of a place, the last thing I ever want to be is on a train and somebody sat opposite me wants to talk to me, because I don't find that easy. I don't find relationships that easy to begin. I think that's a part of my life. So in my spirituality, a walk with Jesus Christ has been important in actually giving me a sense of purpose and worth. But it's a mistake to think that this person on the stage or in the public space is anything other than a human being that is struggling with the question of what does it mean for me to be a human being in Jesus Christ.
Keith, you've been in ordained ministry for nearly 40 years.
Yeah.
How do you go the distance? What has sustained you through all of this as a Christian leader?
I think it's recognising that you have to walk with God, that God can't be locked out and suddenly pulled in to when it's helpful. I've had fantastic support at home. That's critical to all of it. I think it's being prepared yourself to be stimulated. Never believing that something, and although I'm coming to the end of this stage, this isn't the end of, I'm actually hoping to be able to still be around, in March and April in the world. But I think it's that willingness to be prepared to move on and to take on fresh and new challenges. All my roles have been so fundamentally different.
I've often found that writing is quite self-clarifying, and I wonder what the process of writing this book has meant for you. Was there something that you learned or somehow understood in a new way, having committed your thoughts and experiences to the page as you have here?
Well, what I really, above all else, wanted to do was to offer something to people stepping into a role of any kind and asking questions about their own leadership. Because it's been a challenge, and it's been a tough challenge, all the way along the line. I mean, I spent my first 6 months in Australia answering the question, and who are you? Well, they didn't always put it like that, but that's really what they were doing. And it was really challenging to come and to develop and build relationships. And knowing how you do that, and knowing what should be the priority, that's one of the things that lies behind. It's the secret underlying message, as it were.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your secrets here now, but also in your book. We really appreciate you, Keith. Let's thank Keith for his work and for this great book.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Keith. And will you thank Meredith as well for a terrific interview there. I thought it was very interesting hearing Keith talk about, in a sense, the public responsibilities of the role and the way that he's used this platform, this pulpit, if you like, to speak with confidence and authority about things that really matter in society. And one of the things that strikes me is that the range of issues that he's spoken on haven't just been a narrow range of issues, which you can sometimes see the church associated with, but a real sense of the kingdom being in the streets out there with real people on the issues that really matter in our society, and his willingness to speak up with a confidence and an authority and, in a sense, at times a prophetic voice to our society. It's been a very important part of his ministry here, and it's a very important part of the tradition of the ministry here at Wesley Mission, as we've heard. And someone else who's taken on that role and that responsibility of not just running big, vast for purpose organisations, but speaking with a confidence and a clarity around the issues that matter to Australian society is Tim Costello. Now, if the technology works, and I hope it does, there is Tim Costello. Is this not a remarkable technological achievement by the team here at Wesley Mission? Good morning, Tim, and welcome to you across the border, which is a little more robust than we may have anticipated earlier in the year. Welcome to our meeting this morning to celebrate the launch of Keith's new book. You've written the foreword to this book, and we look forward to just hearing from you now. Good morning, Tim.
Good morning. Thanks very much, Mark. And from glorious lockdown here in Melbourne, I wish I could be with you, but that border is very robust. I'm very honoured to have written a foreword for Keith's book, and a book that when I read it, there was that sense of, yes, of course, absolutely. A sense of, well, I could have said that. And then a thought, why didn't I say that? And a realisation that that's why this is a timely book. A book that really brings together what are the words in the title: faith, compassion, and the challenge of business. When we think of those words, there are tensions. Maybe one of the tensions that we see today is that faith and business can, to the secular observer, seem to be too cosy. And when they're too cosy, the secular person and the Christian person will call it prosperity theology. It's the idea that if I have enough faith, it's going to mitigate the challenges in business, and my business is going to grow, and I'm going to be blessed, and I will prosper. Now, I actually believe God wants us to prosper and flourish. That absolutely is an aim. But the prosperity, faith, and business can very easily lead to the idea that to be rich is to be saved, to be poor is to be sinful. And it's too cosy and a degraded theology when it's that sort of understanding of faith and business. Insert the word compassion. Faith, compassion, and the challenge of business, as Keith has done. And suddenly you round out a theology. I have just written, thanks to working with Centre for Public Christianity, a little booklet called The Cost of Compassion, and have been reflecting on how fundamental this is, not just to the gospel, but to being human, and how it is constantly being squeezed and marginalised. And sometimes that's the challenge in terms of business. We're having debates now about for-profit running of aged care, and has it squeezed out compassion? And has it squeezed out care? This is why this book by Keith is so important. It's inserting that word compassion with faith and the challenge of business. Now, I think in writing a book that is obvious and a handbook with great questions, Keith has already plumbed some greater depths in this book. And it certainly comes from faith and reflecting on the fact that faith, compassion, and business aren't necessarily opposites. We often have a Manichaean dualistic view of business and compassion. The Manichaeists actually said that God created spirit, and that is good, and that's pure faith. And evil created matter, and that's bad. Well, we often have that sort of dualistic view about business and about faith and compassion. Of course, God created all. It's a nonsense to think that spirit and matter aren't equally created by God. God created business as much as he wants us to serve and worship him. And when we think of that God, Christian faith really starts with the proposition God exists and asks the question, what does God want from me? And I think that's the fundamental human question. I think humans are made to worship. They will worship something. If it's not God, it will be money, it will be power, it will be sex, it will be self-image. They will worship something. Something will fill that vacuum. That's why I'm so glad for Wesley Mission. I'm so glad for John Wesley, and I've reflected on him in the foreword. I'm a Baptist, but in my first trip ever to England back in 1984, I went on a tour of John Wesley's sites, from the rectory in Epworth where he was born to his chapel and organising centre in London, and I became a Wesley disciple. I loved the way that John Wesley integrated what we might call advocacy and policy, the big issues, with profound compassion, with evangelism. Wesley said that faith issues in social holiness. We often think of faith just in personal holiness. No, Wesley had a vision for the nation, and it's often reflected today how the legacy of Wesleyism was trade unions, empowering of the poor, organised into Methodist societies with the adage, work hard, save as much as you can, give away as much as you can, social holiness. I really became a disciple of John Wesley, and that's why I'm so thankful for Wesley Mission. And in writing this book, Keith, a Methodist minister of the Wesley tradition, now uniting church here in Australia, stands in the stream of that social holiness, bringing together things that we often pull apart, business and also faith and compassion. So the simplest answer to the question, what does God require of me if I'm to worship this God, is really answered in Micah 6:8. God requires this. Do justice. There's the advocacy, the policy settings. Love mercy. There is Wesley's programmatic response to homeless, to Indigenous, to those with the existential angst that they're going to take their lives, running suicide prevention. Love mercy. Reach out. Be sitting in the streets where they're homeless with them and find a merciful solution. And above all, walk humbly with your God. Worship this God. Secularism is really worship of humans. This can't satisfy. It's walking humbly with God, having a relationship with God that satisfies the loneliness, the isolation. Do I matter? This is the foundation in a very practical handbook. I want to thank Keith for this book. I want to thank him for his leadership. I want to thank him for recently working with me, particularly on the gambling issues in New South Wales. I've often been puzzled about the blind spots of gambling in New South Wales. 10% of all the world's pokies in New South Wales. And we know it has captured politics and shaped politics. We only have to watch the regulator inquiring into Crown Casino Barangaroo at the moment and seeing the junkets with criminals coming in. But so much power, so much control, so much influence. It takes courage to speak out on these issues when it is so cosy and such easy money that flows to government. Well, whether it's that issue, whether it's a host of issues, this is the social holiness that brings together faith, compassion, and the challenges of business to organise in a very efficient, effective, impactful way. Thank you, Keith, for writing this book, and God bless you in the future.
Thank Tim Costello. Thanks, Tim, one of our great thinkers and leaders, and wonderful to have you with us. Stay safe, stay well. And now, finally, we've talked about the duality of the role, and is there anything Keith can't do? We know he's written this book. Now he's going to read from it. Will you welcome Keith as he reads an excerpt from his book?
In the introduction, I talk about not being unique in taking on the CEO role of organizations facing particularly a challenging business environment. In fact, suggesting that most CEOs have that challenge to actually face. I was familiar with the latter, being a minister, but not as familiar with the other. Having held leadership roles in the British Methodist Church for 25 years, undertaking the two roles at once was something I had to learn and develop. Indeed, it was not readily understood by those I served. The whole of my time in this position has entailed a sensitive interaction between the two roles, of working how to concurrently be a business leader and a church leader. Let me read something about what faith actually is. Despite all its problems, the church has always been a vital and precious part of my life. It may be surprising to some that I was not brought up in the church. Only as a teenager did I make the decision to be linked to the Methodist Church. And even this choice was made for rather selfish reasons. The church had the best youth club in the town, the best sporting opportunities, and some of the nicest girls. Ultimately, however, it was a community that enabled me to grow. The combination of church and faith assisted me in those early days to make sensible decisions about the direction of my life that it might take as I looked to the future. On leaving school, it helped me to make the decision to work with troubled young people. It guided me to alter my plans to train as a teacher and work with children with a disability. And ultimately, those decisions and work with children led me to think seriously about working in this great organization with children and adults. Responding to the call to take on the Wesley Mission leadership in Sydney was an exercise of faith in itself. The role involved leading more than 2,000 staff and overseeing a turnover of $150 million, and that was in 2005. The role was vastly different from that was held by my contemporaries. When my appointment was announced in Britain, a very senior leader in the British Methodist Church asked me about the role. When I described the scope of the job, it was quite clear that he either didn't believe me, what I was telling him, or he felt he'd misunderstood or misheard the information. My faith in Jesus Christ would be tested many times in my 15 years as leader at Wesley Mission. Tough situations would have beaten me had it not been for faith and confidence in God that I heard about as a teenager. But now that faith had to be lived out in an entirely different world. Faith had many different faces during my Wesley Mission leadership. It made me eager, and this was often demonstrated in terms of a keen and enthusiastic approach to work. It certainly continued to make me display loyalty in circumstances which the opposite of faithfulness and devotion might have consumed me. Faith was not simply saying prayers and attending worship. In real terms, it meant believing that great results were possible in what would have been described as the most difficult of settings.
Thanks, Keith. And Keith will be available to sign a copy of the book in the foyer for you afterwards, and breakfast will also be available there. And if you want him to read more, I'm sure he's available to read more as well. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I want to thank Meredith for her terrific conversation with Keith and for all the insights we gained from that. Thanks to Tanya Plibasek and Tim Costello for joining us as well and taking part in this exclusive launch of the book this morning. And thanks also to Keith, and particular thanks to Carol as well, who I know has been at Keith's side and partner through this entire journey over the last decade and a half, and is an indispensable part. An indispensable part of the leadership here at Wesley Mission. Thank you all for being part of this event, and we look forward to joining you in the foyer shortly. Thank you.